Amazing. So we're going to learn something. Today's is very sort of very technical, but I think it asks us good, important sort of theological, moral, fundamental questions, which I think will be interesting. There is a ton here that we are not going to get to. We're really just going to get a taste at the beginning, and then just know that the discussion continues. So this week's parsha is Mishpatim, which translates sort of as laws. There are lots of different ways of referring to laws and rules, and Mishpatim is one of them. And a mishpat, a ruling, a judgment, a law, something like that. And in this week's parsha is really just, it's again, so many ways, just a list of rules. And one of the rules that shows up, it's not the only place it shows up, but it shows up here for sure, is something that almost every person has heard the phrase, which is an eye for an eye. Now, the rabbis do something really interesting, which is they reject the physical possibility of actually taking someone's eye. And they almost immediately make it into something monetary. So instead of requiring that when someone's been hurt, to hurt them exactly the same way, they switch it to doing something monetary. And so this text we're going to learn today is the justification for that argument, which is to say, if I hurt someone, if the Torah says an eye for an eye, why should I not poke that person's eye out if they poked my eye out? Why is that not a reasonable and a read? Why can't I take this literally? And the rabbis are so committed to not taking it literally, and that's what we're going to learn today. So before I get into the text, does anybody have any thoughts, opinions, sermons, frustrations, questions? What do people think? Yeah, Bill.
I saw a license plate that said an eye for an eye and the whole world will be blind.
Right, famous quote, right? That's the consequence. If you poke everybody's eye out, nobody can see. Right? Sheila and then Ron.
Why the eye? Why is it a hand for a hand or something else? I mean, somewhere an eye must. It's in. I think in the hieroglyphics, there's also they have pictures of the eye. That's
right? I'm going to pull up the text from Safaria because it does say more than eye for an eye. But off the top, it says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, and a foot for a foot. But the question remains, which is why those things? Right? Okay, Ron.
Okay, my first question is, which way is the Torah stated that you should not do unto not do unto others, or you should do unto others? Yeah, so we're going to look at I'm bringing that up because I'm thinking you don't want to do unto others. I mean, you don't want to not. Wait a minute. One way doesn't sound good to me, and I can't remember. I have to stop and think too hard. It's lunchtime. But I was thinking that, and I didn't want to go there, but I'm thinking that this do unto others before they do unto you. Yeah, what you want them to do unto you, or don't do what you find abhorrent to do to you. Like I said, I can't remember which way it is.
Yeah, well, that would be a.
But I have a problem with that, and I'm much more like tzedek tirdof, which is really, that's the overarching thing about this eye for the eye thing, in my opinion.
So
and I think I was listening to JTS this morning, I can't remember, where they said if you take each letter of what's the word? Was it ayin? I think it is. If you move down one letter in the alphabet and then read it backwards, you get kesef. And the rabbis talk about that. That's how they got money out of it.
Oh, gosh.
So, okay, so before we get into that, so the do unto others or do not do unto others is rabbinic, right? So that's going to come later than the Torah. It's already a bit of interpretation. Let's just take a quick glance.
I thought one was in Torah and then it was said the opposite way by Hillel.
No, I think it was said in the negative by Hillel, and the positive is generally attributed to Jesus. I don't think any version of it actually shows up in the Torah. It does say in the Torah, treat your neighbor as yourself, but that's also not exactly the same thing. All right, let's hold on. Let me. I've popped open Safari here. Let me just make sure I've got the right one open. Yeah. Okay. So here is Safaria. Here is where it shows up in our portion this week. It's in the context of slavery and fighting and a pregnant person. And it comes up by saying, basically, when there's fighting or harm, and there's a miscarriage, right? There's a whole context here that I don't want to get into, which is about miscarriage and humans as property. I don't really want to get into that conversation because it's not relevant for what we're talking about today. But effectively, it says, but if no other damage ensues, the penalty shall be a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burn for a burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. There's not a lot of wiggle room in that framework for money. Now, we will see what the rabbis do about that. It shows up also again in Leviticus, where it says here, if any person kills a human being, it uses this verb yakeh, which we'll see is relevant, which really is to strike, to hit, that person shall be put to death, right? So it doesn't exactly say when a party kills a human being, that's subtext, right? So when a person strikes a person, that person shall be put to death. It probably does mean death here, but it doesn't mean it literally. And then it says, if a person strikes a nefesh behema, like nefesh adam is a person, a nefesh behema is an animal, they shall make restitution for it, life for life. So here we start to get this. Maybe it's not right. A person needs to be put to death. An animal, there's restitution. So that's the second place it shows up, and those are the two that are relevant for us today. And the third shows up here in Deuteronomy, in which you should, excuse me, don't let evil things happen. Don't show pity. A life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for a foot. All of which is to say, the literal reading of the text would certainly suggest a very little, a very one-for-one literal understanding. There isn't, the only example, and we'll see the Gemara jumps on this, is when it talks about an animal. But when it talks about a person, the text of the Torah is relatively clear. You should do the damage that the other person experienced, right? That a life for a life, right? And then it goes through all the options that Sheila asked, right? Why all those other listed things. But it's very clear, once we read the rabbis, they're not interested in that read at all. And that's why I wanted to bring it up. Yeah, Sheila.
Did they ever, in fact, I know they have the rule that you need all those witnesses. And that's how they got around doing some of the nasties that were prescribed. But did they, in fact, these are things that were probably done by the Mesopotamians and all the other people. But our Bible was written written down around 500 BCE. Did we ever do this? In England, don't they do in England in the 17th century or 18th century, didn't they do hand for hand? They would chop off a hand if you stole something or you...
I don't know the answer to the last part. I'm not sure how this sort of framework has been implemented in more contemporary societies, let's say the last 500 years. I just don't know. But certainly the rabbis were uncomfortable with the idea of capital punishment and created a restriction, which again is not immediately relevant for today, but I think generally relevant in terms of aesthetic, let's say, that a unanimous court could not put someone to death, and that a court that put someone to death twice in 70 years had to be reconstituted. Which is to say, it could basically never happen. The witnessing and evidentiary requirements were so great that a person would need to have been interrupted in the midst of the act by saying, hey, by the way, don't you know that the punishment is death? And they have to say, yes, I know the punishment is death, and then still do it, right? So like the rules that the rabbis created around this were much greater than the ones that the Torah is prescribing. So let's dig into the Gemara here, and let's see what they did. Can everybody see this? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Can I? So before we get into the translation, I want to point out a few words that I think are important. So here, amai is similar to my. So my, just without the aleph at the beginning, would be like ma, what? And amai means why. So the question at the beginning is, why is something the case? So we're going to look for reasoning in some way. Probably a verse as well. Then we have a verse, ein tachat ayin, right? An eye for an eye. Amar Rachmana, the merciful one said. So whenever it says Rachmana, right, we're talking about God. And already we can see the Gemara is doing something interesting, right? By referring to God as Rachmana here, in the context of harming another person, even potentially in a just way, is already an interesting approach that the rabbis have taken, right? In some way, they're already telling us something is not so rachamim, so compassionate about this model. And then it says ema. Now, ema is Aramaic. I mean, most of this is Aramaic so far. Ema, you'd think is similar to amai, but in fact, it is the same, from the same root as amar, to say. So ema translates to, I might say, or you might say, meaning to say it's going to introduce a possibility, a question. It's going to introduce a possible explanation for the question, the answer, in terms of the answer. So let's read it inside. Can I get a volunteer to read? The Gemara asks. Somebody want to start? Sheila, please.
Okay. The Gemara asks, why does the Mishnah take for granted the fact that one who caused injury is liable to pay compensation to the injured party? The merciful one states in the Torah, an eye for an eye. You might say that this means that the one who caused injury shall lose an actual eye rather than pay money.
Okay, before we go on, the section of Talmud that we're talking within is Bava Kama. Bava Kama is part of the three Bavas. There are three categories, and all of those exist in an order, the bigger category, right? So if you got Mishnah and Talmud, they're split into 6 sections. The order that this one is in is Nezikin, which means damages. So the broader context that this is the conversation is happening in is the question of what happens when one another is owed damages, right? How do we resolve problems? Generally not capital, but certainly a piece of the puzzle. So meaning to say, when my ox gores your ox, what do we do? Is a classic example in here. And here that's going to be the context as well, which is the fundamental question, which is the Mishnah, which we didn't read. Why does it take for granted, meaning to say, why does it assume that injury is resolved by paying compensation versus another injury? And the challenge to that is, right, and the context of that is, God says an eye for an eye in the Torah. And therefore, we might assume, right, one might say, Ema, that this means we should cause injury, that the injury should be replaced by injury rather than paying money. Okay. Any questions or thoughts on this before we go on? Okay, Sheila, continue, right? Read the Gemara.
Gemara responds, that interpretation should not enter your mind. The principle implicit in the Mishnah is derived from a verbal analogy in the Torah, as it is taught in the Baraita.
Wait, pause. Pause. I want to say 2 things before we read on. First of all, remember that the not bold is Rabbi Steinsaltz, and that the bold is the translation. So the first phrase is La Salka Da'atach, which effectively means, I mean, it translates here as not enter your mind. It should not even occur to you. is what it's introducing as. It should not occur to you at all that an actual eye should be the result, and it's going to explain that. And then Rabbi Steinsaltz says a verbal analogy here. Generally speaking, what that means is that we're talking about a turn of phrase. He hasn't said that yet. The actual text of it doesn't say a verbal analogy, but we will see. And here I want to just point out one other thing in the Aramaic. So it says Ditanya, which introduces a baraita, which Sheila already read, right? It was taught in a baraita, which means that we're talking about an early period in rabbinic history. And then it uses this word yachol, which we haven't gotten translated yet. Yachol, in modern Hebrew means will be able to. But in Talmud, it actually doesn't mean that at all. It means if, how do I say this? As if it were possible would be one translation. It means that like you could think this, right? It's a little outside the boundaries, but you could think this is what Yachol is. And then the phrase Talmud Lomar will take a verse to tell us that it's not true. So we already know this Talmudic construction is you might have thought this thing, it's not true, and here's a proof text from the Torah. Even though it says Talmud Lomar, it's always a verse. Is everybody with me with what I've said so far, even if we haven't read it?
Yachol Omar is you would be able to think, right?
Yachol and then
Today.
Talmud Lomar. Yeah. All right, go on. Let's read it inside. It was taught in a baraita.
It was taught in a baraita based on the verse, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. One might have thought that if one blinded the eye of another, the court blinds his eye as punishment. Or if one severed the hand, court severs the hand, broke a leg, breaks the leg. One who strikes
Wait, pause.
therefore the verse states.
Pause. Right, so here is the possibility, or this is the you might have thought, you could have considered, it might have occurred to you, it could be possible, and now we're going to get the rejection. Therefore, the verse states, go on.
One who strikes a person, and the verse also states, and one who strikes an animal, to teach that just as one who strikes an animal is liable to pay monetary compensation, so too one who strikes a person is liable to pay monetary compensation.
Amazing.
That is very interesting because while they defend they say because it's next to each other, one who strikes an animal, I mean, that's a livelihood. Why you would even, if you're going to talk about you don't do an animal for an animal, why would you even put down a person for a person?
So right, so this is the reference to these two verses that we read. If a person strikes another person, mot yumat, that person shall surely put to death. But one who strikes kills an animal, right? They do a tashlum, they do shalmena, right? Shall make restitution for that, life for a life. Meaning to say, we have this framework that if it's an animal, the animal's life can be replaced financially, right? Because they're not considering a real life in the same way as a human life, right? And so they're saying, okay, just as it says strikes a person, it says strikes an animal, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it kills them, but basically to say, right, that if you strike a person, it's similar to an animal, and therefore it's compensation because the animal says compensation. What's the problem with this argument? What's the problem with this framework that we've now presented, right? We thought, we can actually just harm them the same way, right? But the verse tells us, an animal and a person is similar, and the animal is compensation, and therefore we replace it. What's the problem? The previous verse says, if you strike a person, you got to be dead. You got to be killed. It's not a strong argument. They're ignoring that whole half of the sentence. You'll see that we're going to come back to that. Is everybody with me so far with this argument? Yeah? Any questions? Just for clarification. Okay, let's keep going. Can I get another volunteer to read this next phrase, this next paragraph? Yeah, Bob.
And if it is your wish to say that there is an objection to this derivation, there is an alternative derivation. The verse states, "And you shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, for he shall die." This indicates that it is only for the life of a murderer that you shall not take ransom, but you shall take ransom for one who severed another's extremities, which is analogous to the death of a limb, as severed limbs do not regenerate.
So I love it. The Gemara is telling us that we are not salamanders. We do not regenerate our limbs, right? Okay. If anybody's regenerating a limb, please see your local scientist. So here, right, it says, okay, if that argument of striking person versus striking an animal doesn't do it for you, here's an alternative. We have a verse in the Torah that says, "You shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, for that person shall die." And the word for ransom is kofer here, right? Tikhu kofer. And it basically just means financial payment, meaning to say that in the Torah it says, you're not allowed to take monetary restitution when you're going to put a murderer to death, right? You can't replace their capital punishment with money. Which is to say, the Gemara then says, it's only in the context of a murderer who's going to be killed by a capital punishment that you can't take ransom. But in every other case, you can take ransom. And the context of the Torah that we saw before, when it says you shall strike a person, it's referring to a limb and not a person. And when it says life, they're talking about the life of the limb and not the person. So again, you can see the rabbis are doing everything possible to bend the text to mean what they want it to mean. Yeah, Nelson. Oh, you're muted.
I'm confused by the word murderer. A person's a murderer means that they're guilty of killing somebody. It's not like there's murderers who aren't guilty of killing anyone.
Correct.
And you might assume that anybody who kills somebody is a murderer. I don't think that's true in English, but
it's not true in the Torah either. Meaning to say that you can accidentally kill someone and not be a murderer in the Torah.
good.
Go on, Nelson.
No, so I don't understand why it says you shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who's guilty of death. I mean, to be it sounds like there could be murderers who aren't guilty of death.
That's interesting. I'm not knowledgeable enough around punishments for murder in which to say if there's another category, but I think that this is how I would understand it if I was in the eyes of the rabbis, which is that there is a context in which someone might be a murderer, but because of exigent circumstances may not be liable for death. But here it's saying, in the Torah, it says, if they're guilty of death and they're a murderer, you can't take ransom. But you're right. You're right to say there's some category boundaries here that are not well defined. Again, that's the Torah, not the Gemara. Gemara spends more time defining that stuff. But I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, Bob.
I don't understand why they go through all this rigmarole to evade what they don't like. Why not just say the punishment is abhorrent as the crime is, so we need an alternative way to do it, and that is a monetary fine or expulsion or whatever process they wanted to use to punish a crime. Just say what you want to do instead of going through all this logical misinformation to come to a wrong conclusion that it doesn't fit.
Yeah, so I think part of this requires us to put ourselves in the mind of the rabbis of the Gemara here a little bit, because I think you're right, which is to say, in various legal theories, we might say that it doesn't matter, right? So there's a term for it, which is now escaping me at the moment, which is to say you can only make law based on the information that already exists, which is to say your source text, which is the Torah in this case. And there's a legal theory that says all you're left with is what's already in there, and you have to be able to work within that. And there are additional legal theories that say, no, you can have additional information from the outside that allows you to make that distinction. So that's concept one, I think, is relevant. There's a term for it, and it's escaping me at the moment, but I will remember. We learned about it in rabbinical school from Rabbi Elliot Dorff. The second thing I think is important is, for the most part, the rabbis are committed, right, to trying their best to live a life in alignment with what the Torah says. And so they are left with the problem, which is what happens when what the Torah says is unjustifiable or unacceptable for one reason or another. They can't reject the first part, which is to say, I have to follow Torah. They've accepted that as axiomatic for them. And so they're forced in some sense to say, if I don't like this thing that I have to accept, I have to do something else to give myself room. And I think part of the rabbinic tradition is that dance. And I think for our modern ears, we would just say, well, it's clearly totally messed up and not okay and not acceptable. We're just going to ignore that part. As moderns, we're much more comfortable with that. Maybe not totally comfortable, right? But certainly the rabbis would be very uncomfortable. And so they have to go through this whole rigmarole to get the outcome they want, because they can't say this thing from Torah is ridiculous, right? And so there's a delicate balance there, right? They are trying their best to follow the laws as they understand God-given. How can you say the Torah is not accurate when God gave it to you? Now, I'm not suggesting you should believe that. I don't believe that so literally, but for the rabbis in the Talmud, they certainly did. And so they make this dance, but it rubs us as moderns in a really interesting way that we're saying, why are you going through all this rigmarole? Just do the thing. Just say it's not okay. So I hear you. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, what about during times of war, whether it's an accidental killing or an intentional killing?
Yeah, so I don't think they're talking about war here. Certainly they would make they do make a distinction around accidental killing. That is the whole concept of the cities of refuge, in which is described in the Torah, which is effectively the ir miklat, which is to say, if I accidentally kill someone and their family member is justifiably wanting to hold me liable for that, but it was totally an accident. The primary example in the Talmud is where you're holding a bunch of sharp items and you and the other person both turn the corner at the same time, you accidentally kill them. That's sort of the example. Imagine you're holding a spear out directly in front of you. When you turn the corner, they accidentally get speared through. That, it's like not really your fault, but you've certainly killed someone. You have this place that you can go to be protected, and those are the cities of refuge. And so they don't really have a concept for that. And I think they just recognize that war is its own context, and they're not talking about that here. Ron.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not opposed to what they've done in this particular case, because it's as the word came out, abhorrent to do what it says. But what's to stop them or us now from finding a way to negate the 10 Commandments, for instance? I think we're going down a slippery slope when we do this, and we got to be really careful about it.
Right. So I think that is part of the paradox of this series of texts, this text in particular, and some of the other ones we've seen, but certainly this one, which is we know that the result is the right one, which is that we don't want to be constantly killing our people. Even if they've done something abhorrent, the rabbis really don't want power to be killing individuals. And at the same time, where's the limit? At what point can you say anything means anything? And I think that's real. Like, I don't have a resolution to that. I think that is incumbent. That's part of the paradox of this text. Let's keep going. Let's see where else this Gemara goes, because I think it'll be interesting to see. Can I get another volunteer? Was it Bob? You read this one, right? Read the next one also, if you don't mind. This is the Gemara asks.
The Gemara asks, to which verse is the Baraita referring when it quotes one who strikes a person and one who strikes an animal? If we say that the Baraita is referring to the verse, one who strikes an animal shall pay its compensation, and one who strikes a person shall be put to death, this cannot be, as that verse is written with regard to killing, not injury, and there's no monetary compensation for killing.
Right, so here we've already, and we're starting to like split hairs a bit here, right? Which is to say that the verse that we looked at, again, the word for strike is makeh, which doesn't necessarily mean killing, but they're taking a contextual understanding, saying this is probably about killing, and therefore killing is not equivalent in the same way. Yeah, Sheila.
Excuse me. It disturbs me if we're saying that this comes from a Baraita. Oh, excuse me. Which infers that this is what was left out of the Mishnah, correct?
A Baraita, yes, means that
Okay.
it does
But
not
this
exist.
But this is a pretty important thing. Why was this not put into the Mishnah?
Which part?
The whole thing about striking and what they're doing and,
Right.
and the compensation. This should be not a Braita. This should be something they should have considered.
I love that, right? So which is to say that on some level, if this was so important, they should have codified it in a more effective way than just being a Braita, which I often use to explain is the stuff that was on the cutting room floor, right? If it's important, it should be in the Mishnah. It should be in some other authoritative location. I don't have any answer to that because I think that is very reasonable. With the only caveat, which is to say that I don't think the rabbis felt that Baraitot were not authoritative, right? That they were as a Baraita and a Mishnah or as close to equivalent as it could be without being equivalent. If you had an Amora, which is the conversation that's happening here is probably 150 to 200 years later because it's in Aramaic and therefore it's the Amoraim and they're quoting their predecessors, that for them they are more likely to say a Baraita and a Mishnah are basically equivalent. But your point remains, which is if this was important, it should have been codified before this and not in this discussion necessarily. I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a great.
Is there a book of the Braita? What's that?
Yeah, so there are a number of places in which Braitot can be found. Generally speaking, Braitot are found in what's called the Tosefta, right? The Tosefta, right? You might know what it is. I'm going to find it anyway. So a Tosefta is basically another collection of Tanaitic sources that are not the Mishnah. So sometimes they're exactly the same as the Mishnah. Sometimes they're different. They're generally less well organized. They're less edited than the Mishnah was. In many standard Talmud, sort of Vilna Talmud editions, you will find the collection of the Tosefta in the back. And so it's still something that's important to be learning. There are other midrashim in other places, and some Braitot are actually only found in the Talmud, and they don't have other sources that we still have. In some cases, Braitot look totally made up. So, they are as authoritative as we let them be on some level.
But the Toseftas are all ancient. They're not the new commentaries.
They are from the same time period as the Tanaim.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's the same time period as the Mishnah.
Is there a separate book? What I'm trying to say is
there isn't a book of just
somebody's.
No, there is not a book that's just like, here are all Braitot. Braita is our term for a Tanaitic source that's not in the Mishnah. So it could be from the Tosefta, it could be in a midrashic source, it could be in all sorts of places. It could only exist in the Talmud. A Braita is our term for a Tanaitic source that's not in the Mishnah. But I'm really glad you brought that up. David and then Bob.
I'm going to offer this. I don't know how authoritative it is or isn't, but it's something I heard in another Talmud class as an explanation for why perhaps even important Braitot are not included in the Mishnah. And the explanation was that this is supposed to be the oral law. And if we take supposed to be seriously, not only was it maybe never supposed to be written down, but maybe it's almost a tragedy that it had to be written down. So when Yehuda Hanasi and his circle are choosing what's going into the Mishnah, it's not so much necessarily that they're leaving Braitot on the cutting room floor. They're saying, okay, everybody in our circle understands these Braitot. They don't need to go in the Mishnah. They're not going to be lost. But we're putting in the Mishnah what we're afraid is going to be lost because the Romans are being so tough on us. That's just one theory anyway. So it doesn't mean they're not important. It just means they didn't get included, not only maybe because they were on the cutting room floor, but maybe because we all understand these things, or we think we do. What we want to put in the Mishnah is what we're afraid we'll lose understanding of.
Yeah, great. So I want to bring two things up. One is I want to be clear that the cutting room floor is euphemistic. Like I don't necessarily, that's just for us to understand it. I don't really think that they were saying, oh, this is in and this is out, this is in, this is out. They had what they had in front of them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, it is true that the rabbis were deeply uncomfortable with the concretization of the Mishnah and other sources from oral law. And there are places in which the text itself, again, in the irony of ironies, says, we shouldn't have been writing this down, but I've written this down. And in one place it says, you know, that it will be endless. There will just be books on books on books on books, which of course is exactly what has happened. And so I think the third thing I'm going to say is, in the time of the Tanaim, the word Tana actually refers, like if we were to take Tanaim as a general category and really try and define what exactly a Tana was, a Tana referred to a specific individual in the study hall whose job it was to memorize the oral law. And so their job would be basically the human version of the book, which is you would say, hey, Tana, what is that source by Rabbi Akiva that says blank? And they would like spool it out from their memory. The Tanaim of that time period don't all refer to those people who've memorized the text, but certainly an individual Tana often refers to that. And there are stories of that. So there is this delicate balance between something written down and concretized versus not. Bob, and then we're going to read ahead.
On a slightly different tangent, is this the basis for our current death penalty?
An eye for an eye?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know enough about the American legal code to speak on that, but I can certainly say, for me personally, that this kind of reasoning, among others, is the reason why I am not supportive of the death penalty personally. But I don't know enough about the American system to know exactly where it derives from. I'm sorry, I just don't know the answer. I wouldn't be surprised if this informs it, though. All right, let's read ahead. Can I get another volunteer to read this alternative explanation here? Another alternative. Yeah, Nelson. And right as Nelson unmutes, here it's going to say Ella mihacha. Rather, we should get another understanding from here. Go for it.
Rather, the Baraita references the verse from here. One who strikes an animal mortally shall pay its compensation, a life for a life. And juxtaposed to that is the verse, and if a man maims his neighbor as he has done, so shall it be done to him. The Gemara challenges, but this latter verse does not use the expression one who strikes, which is the basis for the comparison in the Baraita. The Gemara responds, we're stating an analogy from striking to striking that is based not upon the exact phrasing of the verse, but but upon the details of the halakha as follows. Just as the act of striking that is stated with regard to an animal renders one liable to pay monetary compensation, so too the act of striking that is stated with regard to a person renders one liable to pay monetary compensation.
Great. So here, the alternative is we quote a bunch of verses, different verses, and here this one feels very similar to our original source text. If a person maims their neighbor as they have done, so it should be done to them. Seems pretty equivalent to an eye for an eye. The Gemara responds with an analogy, and you can see the analogy in the Gemara itself where it says ma, and then it says af. That construction always means just as, so too. And the analogy they make is saying it's not really about the actual words one strikes, right? Let's not get lost in spelling, as it were, but rather the concept. And it says, just as when we're referring to striking in front of an animal, and there's monetary compensation in response, we do the same thing for a person. So if it's true for an animal, it's true for a person. Okay. Nelson, keep reading. Read this next paragraph for me.
The Gemara challenges, but isn't it written in the verses discussing one who injures another, and a man who strikes any person mortally shall be put to death? Which presumably means that in the case of one who severs another's extremity, the same injury, that is death of a limb, is done to the one who caused the injury, and he does not pay monetary compensation. The Gemara answers, the verse does not mean that his limb shall be put to death, that is removed, but rather that he should pay compensation with money. The Gemara asks, from where do you say that the verse is referring to paying compensation with money? Why not say that he is punished with actual death, that is loss of a limb?
Great. So here we have a challenge to that argument, right? Which is to say that we have a verse that says if a person strikes another person, they shall be put to death. And here they're already limiting it, which is that death refers to a limb, right? So that's how they make the eye for the eye work, right? In terms of it's not necessarily their whole life, it could be the part that was harmed. But the problem is that this text doesn't say that. The text is pretty clear on its surface of what it means. And this source doesn't do it for them, which is to say they are committed to the conclusion that we shouldn't be in the process of harming one another, even if there's a justifiable reason for it. And instead, we can do recompense instead. And here's what it says. The Gemara answers, that interpretation, lo salka ba'atach, it should not enter your mind for two reasons. First, one reason is that this verse juxtaposed to the next one. One who strikes an animal mortally shall pay for its compensation, meaning to say, even though the one above says you should strike a person who shall be put to death, we have one about animals paying compensation. So we have that context. And furthermore, it is written after it, a fracture for a fracture, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. As he is given a blemish to a person, so shall it be given unto him. This is interesting. And learn from the use of the word given that the verse is referring to money. Shma mina mamon. Don't learn from this that you should do the same action to them. Learn mamon. And Rabbi Steinsaltz is the one who's telling us that Natan refers to giving, refers to money, but it's helping us put the pieces together. The rabbis are committed to not letting this mean we harm each other physically. The Gemara asks, and what potential difficulty with the first derivation did the Gemara refer when it prefaced its second derivation of the phrase, if it is your wish to say, which is the question, effectively, I'm going to re-say the question, which is, they didn't like the one strikes argument at the beginning. Why did they even introduce a second one? The Gemara explains. The Braita means that a further difficulty was troubling to the Tana. What did you see that led you to derive the principle of monetary payment from the phrase, one who strikes an animal? Why not derive the halakha from the verse, one who strikes a person? Right? Meaning to say, why are we drawing on an animal instead of a person? Why are we ignoring one verse to the benefit of the other? And the last one, again, we're only going to read, but maybe we won't finish the whole thing. Again, this goes on for quite a bit. We're not going to read the whole thing. I just sort of want to get us a taste of it. The sages say in response, The halachot of damages are derived from a verse concerning damages, and the halachot of damages are not derived from a verse concerning death. The Gemara questions this statement. On the contrary, why not say the halachot concerning a person are derived from a verse concerning a person, and the halachot concerning a person are not derived from the verse concerning animals? Here's the part. It keeps going and going, and we're not going to read the whole thing. But this question, I think, is really fascinating, which is to say, the rabbis want to have arguments about similar categories in context with other categories. Meaning to say, if we're talking about damages, we should be talking damages. If we're talking about death, we should be talking about death. We should not mix the subjects and derive lessons from the wrong one. And the rabbis are offering another alternative. The Gemara is saying, well, actually, shouldn't we be deriving from person to person, animal to animal? Why are we mixing those? All of this is to say, I know we're not going to hit resolution because we knew the answer before we started, which is we have this whole discussion in which the rabbis are fundamentally committed to not allowing us to harm each other physically in this way. Now, certainly the rabbis are not perfect. They let us harm each other in other ways, in ways that we shouldn't. I'm thinking about agunot, for example, right? Women who are forced into situations because their husbands won't divorce them with paperwork, right? That's certainly a place of harm that the rabbis didn't resolve and we're still in the process of resolving. But certainly the rabbis are committed here, and they don't really give a reason for why they don't want the legal system to be chopping off people's hands, to be poking out their eyes, to be maiming each other. They want to make that resolution something that is financial, something that isn't going to be bodily. And I'm sort of struck by this commitment. And I think it tells us something about who the rabbis were and what mattered to them and what world they wanted to live in, even if they didn't live in that world exactly. And I find it challenging on all the ways that we talked about, but also really inspiring that the rabbis were, and I think, Bob, you were making references, why go through this whole rigmarole? Just say what it should say. I think there's something inspiring in going the long way. There's something to be said for working out all the pieces in the middle to get to the place where you want to be. And it's not always as easy, and it's not always as linear. But to me personally, I'm not convincing. You can do whatever, you can feel what you want. But I think for me, there's something compelling about going the long way around. And I think in some cases, it can do more good than just getting to the end. Not always. Certainly there are people harmed along the way, but I think there's something compelling about it personally. Yeah, Bob, since I what do you have to say?
Well, it's interesting to me that I'm unmuted, right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. It's interesting that they're dealing with a population that's not educated. And if you make an argument as difficult to follow as you can get to the result that you want and everybody's happy. But when you're dealing with an educated, learned, sophisticated population, you just come off as being dishonest.
I want to make sure I understand. You're suggesting that that if the audience is as knowledgeable about the laws as the rabbis, and the rabbis are really talking to each other, right? So we're probably in that category. That there is, it looks intellectually dishonest to go through all the argument when you know that you were never willing to accept the alternative.
Right.
I think there's something. Oh, please.
And that for the people that had to live by these laws, who weren't rabbis, who weren't simple people, who were farmers or shepherds, and they wouldn't understand the argument. You're passing You're giving them laws based on a false argument.
So I want to say two things. I hear you, right? I think there's real legitimacy, and you're making a great point. I want to make two contextual points. One is, I think it's important for us to remember that the rabbis were in the significant minority. They were mostly talking to themselves, and most Jews at the time didn't care, and they were doing whatever they're going to do anyway. So much has changed since then, as I'm sure we all know. That's true. So I do think on some level they aren't really implementing these rules on anyone else. It's very imaginary, right? They didn't have a lot of power. That being said, right, the second piece is, I think we live even now in a very sophisticated society in which we don't understand things. I'll give you a funny example from this morning. I was watching a number of videos on how electricity works, and my understanding, right, that electricity just goes along the wires, which actually is not exactly how it works at all. In fact, it doesn't work that way in any way, shape, or form. And my mind was sort of blown by this. Doesn't mean that when I plug something in, it doesn't work, or when I hire the electrician, they understand it.
Nelson, we have to go
And
in a few minutes.
oops, sorry.
Okay. Not yet.
Oh, Nelson, that's you. Sorry. So which is to say that I think we live in a world in which we do not ever understand all the things that we accept as true, right? That doesn't reject your argument, because your argument still stands, which is they're still bending the rules in ways that I think don't pass the smell test, right? And so I think your point still remains, but I think we still accept arguments that we don't totally understand. I don't know. I've never read every Supreme Court case result. I've read quite a few, but not all of them. But we accept them as true nonetheless. But I think your point remains. Again, I'm not arguing with you. I think your point remains. Nelson, and then David.
Well, I just want to say, number one, just last comment. I'm sure you're right that we accept arguments we don't understand, and so I don't question that in any way at all. I'm a little shocked about electricity, but that's another issue.
Me too.
Oh.
But it seemed to me what the rabbis wanted was a world in which every decision could be undone. And the problem with capital punishment is it can't be undone. And they're trying to get to that world. And I think that's something peasants can understand, because they suffer enormously from decisions that are imposed upon them, and there's no way out.
It's interesting, right? The desire to be able to undo things, right? That metaphysical Control Z, if you will.
Yes.
That's interesting. I've never thought about that before. Certainly, a monetary payment can be undone, or can be done in lots of different ways.
But I think it also speaks to their sense of the divorce. I mean, I think they're suffering. They wish there was a way to undo the divorce, but they don't know. And when they deal with pregnancy and the like, they try to undo the scandals and find faults with themselves so that they can make the woman free to marry again.
Certainly in the modern era, right, the efforts to free women, right, aguna means chained, right? Free women does exist, in which they will go, regardless of his politics. Shoot, what's his name? I have his books here, I can't remember his name. Avadia Yosef, Rabbi Avadia Yosef, made incredible efforts to free women, especially in the context of war, where people's bodies couldn't be found, to make sure that they would be able to live their own lives again. The pendulum swings in different directions. That's not always true. I don't want to get too lost, because in divorce and pregnancy and miscarriage and all that, it's actually much, it's very much its own category. But I think the principle of saying capital punishment is very permanent, and we don't want things to be that permanent. I think there's something to there's some compelling nature to that. David, you're gonna get the last word before we end for today.
So first, again, my apologies for being late. So I missed, if this has been said already, you can cut me off. But I think context is important. How proactive they're being and how reactive they're being could be a subject of debate, a heck of a lot more study. So I'm certainly not saying where on a spectrum of proactive on one end and reactive on the other they might fall. But we do know that their context, at least in Mishnaic times, is one of Roman persecution. And it does seem to me that it not taking away from anything they did, because what they did was quite remarkable, but they're doing it in a context where streets are lined with crosses from which people are hanging, frequently for relatively minor crimes. They're in a context where a Roman father can kill his son at a whim. His son doesn't even insult him, but he does something he just doesn't like, and he says, all right, you're dead. And it's okay under Roman law. In that kind of context, and with what our Torah seems to be telling us on a broader, larger basis, kudos to the rabbis for deciding that we don't do that kind of thing on the one hand. And then on the other hand, I think you're right. If you referred to this already, then again, my apologies, but I know there's a section of Gemara, maybe it's in Sanhedrin, I'm not sure exactly, but maybe it's in more than one place. But the idea is a court that would actually sentence somebody to death more than once in 7 years, and others say more than once in 70 years, is a slaughterhouse court, or whatever their phrase is. So clearly, if we're all created in the image of God, we don't lightly destroy that image.
Yeah, I mean, I think the contextual piece is interesting, right? Which is, I mean, the world is full of, we are very separated from death in our modern era, and the rabbis were certainly experienced more of it than we are. But certainly that they are seeing a world, a pretty brutal world around them, and not wanting to replicate that certainly could be a part of their thinking. I think that texts like this is from Bava Kama 83 and 84, if you're interested in looking at it on your own. I think that the rabbis are interested in creating a world that they want and are willing to bend the rules in particular ways. And I'm going to give you another example that's totally separate from this, which is, I was talking to a colleague yesterday, and he was making the point, he was framed it in a really interesting way, which he said is, chicken isn't meat in halacha. It's not meat. We treat it like meat, but it's not meat. And again, personal persuasions notwithstanding, in some ways, they are saying something similar here, which is, yeah, there's a capital case here, but it's not a capital case. We're treating it as if it's not a capital case. It's a capital case, but we're not treating it that way. We are choosing to not treat it that way for one reason or another. And I think it should give us pause, not because of the result, we happen to like this result, but because the process brings stuff up, right? All the stuff that all of you have mentioned about, is this really the way we want the system to work? Could anything mean anything? What kind of results does this lead to? But I do think these sections of Talmud and the context give us a peek, an eye, pardon the pun, into what the rabbis thought and how they wanted the world to work. And I think it should make us feel a little squiggly inside. And I think I think we did that. With that in mind, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I hope you have a eye full of Shabbat this week, with all of your limbs as intact as they could be. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.